Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the Writer's Realm podcast, and thanks for joining us on the epic adventure we call writing. We're your hosts, Bob Adato,
Holly Robilliard.
And Austin Matthews.
and today we're going to talk about character voice. This is episode one in a short series we're discussing about POV, point of view. I mean, as you know, our books hopefully will have more than one character in them. And so, what do you do to distinguish between all these different characters? And some books have 20, 30 different characters, right? I mean, the bigger, longer the series, the more characters there is going to be. So, we need to figure out how to, like paint them all a different color so they're not all shades of green or blue or what have you. We need some bright colors in there and some muted colors and some gray shadows. And anyways, you get my point. So here we are. Austin, how do we do this with POV?
Yeah,
Where's a good place to start?
I think starting with just what is a character voice. So like when you think about the way that I would tell a story versus the way Bob would tell a story about like what happened at work yesterday, or what we did yesterday. Like even if the exact same thing happened to both of us, we would focus on different details. We would use different slang. We would talk about these things in very different ways. And then if you throw Holly in the mix, she's telling that exact same story a very different way. And so that is character voice. It's the way that that person's history, their, slang and all of that stuff, and the way that they see the world influences the way that they talk or the way that they describe things. But then the question is how do you develop a character voice?
Yeah, I think Holly knows.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so the biggest thing for me, and this can be really hard, I think, and I will say this for for existing writers and for new writers, this can be really, really difficult because I think, in my opinion, the best way to develop or to make an interesting character voice is to have their backstory, right? Because you can't speak from that character's point of view unless you know that character. And that's not something that you're going to have on page 10, 20, 30, right? You might be in the middle of your book before you really start to understand who your character is once they've gone through that, once they're starting to get through that character arc. So I think that's kind of what you have to keep in mind is that you might not get it the first try, but keep trying. And just really hone in on that backstory and figuring out who your character is and who they want to be.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Like, I feel like that's such a big thing for drafting. Like, once you've gotten through your first draft, like maybe worry about it a little bit in your first draft, but once you're going through on draft two, you're like, I know where this character started, I know where they end. I can kind of, even show a change in that character voice as that happens in the way that they talk about the people around them or the things that are around them. And so I think that's a really good perspective that you have on that, Holly.
Yeah, I think you'll notice it as well once you start going through, like you said, on your second draft, you're going to be going through and you're going to read a line or a piece of dialogue that your character says, and it's going to trigger it in your mind, and you're going to be like, they would never say that, or they would never act that way, or things like that. You will pick up on. You just have to kind of get through the thick of it first, and that's when you have to keep in the back of your mind, like, what do I want their voice to be like, and try and frame your character and their story in a way that's going to reflect that.
Yeah, my two characters that I'm using, that's because right now that's all I have. I just have the two main characters on my book, Coil and Thing. And so one is a detective, so she has a very analytical, logical mind. And she wants something. Both of my characters have a lot of agency. They definitely want, she wants to find her ex-fiance who left her to die. And then I have my assassin who just wants to so she's hard. I mean, see, automatically in my head I'm already like switching gears because she has a struggle between trusting who she's working with, because since she's an assassin, she doesn't want to trust anyone. She can't afford to do that. Because everyone could betray you, so she has to like force herself to trust Coil the detective in order to work together, to fight the bad guys. But her brain is always strategic. She's looking for all the exits. She's looking in she's very, very self-aware of everything around her to use as a weapon. So it's almost like we're talking about, you put whoever your character is, kind of put yourself in their shoes and like, what do you see? You
Mm-hmm.
know, how are they going to react to something?
Yeah.
You know, what are they looking at, or what are they not looking at, or you know, just you gotta kind of dig yourself into their shoes and sit there for a while.
Yeah, and you talking about that. So like the work that I'm sharing in our writers group is mostly letters between, a brother and sister. And so the sister is very like studious, very like formal in her writing. And then her brother, like literally he guides his entire life by the idea of balance. So he's trying very hard to be the opposite of her. So she's formal, so he's purposely being informal. She talks about like magic in this very academic way. She's like, oh, arcanists this. And he's like, oh, magicians, like whatever, like very flippant about the entire thing. But like if he was talking to somebody else, like his voice is determined by everybody else's voices in the room.
Mhm.
And so like that one's a very particularly interesting character to write because it's like his voice isn't really his voice, but that is his voice. And it's just this really fun exercise.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's interesting to really get into that perspective of like he's also judging everybody, and that is his voice that kind of carries through all of it. Is he's very judgmental of people,
Yeah.
and you kind of get that undertone of it, like, oh yeah, he kind of just is very cynical at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you have to be really cautious as well about your slang, and not necessarily your slang, but like you're saying, how your character speaks.
Mm-hmm.
I know that was some feedback that I've recently gotten from you guys on one of my characters, was because I was kind of putting a character forward in a certain way and she was speaking a certain way. And then like halfway through a conversation, she just started dropping her G's and was talking like very lower class. And I didn't really realize it, but then once you guys had mentioned it, I'm like, oh right. And that's not how I want this character to be portrayed. So that was, one character, two character voices, and you can't have that. So you have to, make
Mm-hmm.
that decision. Do I want her to speak with like a slower, like more of what would be considered for this novel lower class, quote unquote, or do I
Mm-hmm.
want her to have more of like an upper crest, kind of tone to her voice?
Now, what
Yeah.
if
Go ahead.
we're let's just pretend we're writers. I don't know very many extroverted writers who love to go to parties and social gatherings. Most of us are very comfortable at the keyboard or at home, you know. Um, so what can we do for, if somebody asks like, well, I never leave my house or hardly ever. I mean, how am I going to figure that out? How am I going to figure out if I'm not around other people? Because that's where you do learn real people,
Mm-hmm.
their voice, as it were, their character, who they are. So how would we go about helping somebody with that?
Yeah, oh, I mean, like we get influence from so many places, not just like the people that we're physically around. Like you said, like I am perfectly comfortable spending all day alone. But like I still read books, I watch TV, I listen to the radio, listen to podcasts, and like I can get those influences there. And like I was talking about how like I have a very scientifically advanced civilization in my books, but like I've chosen to be like, okay, I'm going to take this weird random aspect of our world that's real and put all of their accents are going to be Wild West accents because like it doesn't really matter. Like the level of technology has nothing to do with the way that they speak, but them being from a culture. And so in my books now, if you have a Wild West accent, you are from this
Yeah.
scientifically advanced culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so just being like, hey, this is the shortcut, like dictionary of like, or like map of like what my worlds look like. So people with this upbringing are going to sound like this. And it doesn't have to match with what we have here. And I mean, it might even be a good thing of talking about themes of like, why do we assume people are less intelligent because they sound like this?
Mm.
Because that's not really how things work.
No.
Because when you're looking at a character's voice, like if they sound like they're dropping their G's, like yeah, that might in that culture make them lower class, but does that make them less intelligent? Does that make them a worse
Not at
business
all.
owner? And so looking at like what is my character? What's important about my character? And how does that develop their voice?
Mm.
Like I have a culinary expert in one of my books. So he talks a lot about how like things like taste or like these more like visceral things like as opposed to looking at things like Zoe does in Arcanist Cookbook, she's not thinking about that. She's thinking of like very academic, very removed, very cold, kind of
Mm.
calculated things. And so that's the distinction in those voices is like what are they focused on and why?
Hmm.
I think as well, for whatever type of character you're thinking of having, or whatever voice you want your character to have, and I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that somebody out there has made a character just like that, right? Maybe not just like that, but similar. So even if you are like a homebody, you don't want to go out anywhere, you don't want to talk to anybody, you don't want to see anybody, if you know, like I have a character in another book that I started kind of fleshing out, and I'm like, I want this character to be like these girls back in the day, like back when I was in like grade school, high school, middle school kind of thing, just very like mean girl vibes. And I mean, I haven't been in school in that atmosphere for quite a long time now. And so I'm like, you know, what were those girls like? Well, what can I do? I can go grab a movie. I can go put on Mean Girls on TV or watch, you know, any show about any young adult show that's in like a high school or a school or whatever. You're going to see those characters there, and you can use that for research, you know, like just little things like that. I feel like there's always some way that you can find an abundance of characters that you can learn from.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as you're taking all that stuff in too, it's like if you write something, it's super useful to like actually read it out loud and like try and take on that character's voice in a very like tangible physical sense and be like, okay, do all the words actually fit into what I would imagine their vernacular is like?
Excuse me. I always cough just when we're doing the podcast, so never ever.
Only
ever.
time any of us are sick.
Anytime, yeah. That's just that time of the season. Yeah, so upbringing, yes, talk about slang. Lucky for me, since I was a cop for 30 years, I got to hear, I did get to hear, I don't want to say people from the hood, but gang slang, I guess we could call it. And they're absolutely, just because they don't have a piece of paper education does not mean they're not educated. They're absolutely intelligent, very, very streetwise. So yeah, that's true. I mean, doesn't matter unless you're purposely making your character dumb. Then go for it. But what are some good exercises? Austin, I see something here. Do a conversation with no dialogue tags.
Yeah, so something that I don't remember where I heard about this exercise, but it's so useful. Is like if you have a conversation between two people, it should be very clear as the reader reads it, even if there's no like, oh, so and so said blank, and then person answer blank. Like you should be able to just do quotes, what they said, back and forth ad infinitum, and know who's saying what just by the way they're saying it, what they're saying it, because one, they'll have different points of view that you should be like, oh yeah, I know that character X stands for this, character Y stands for this. There's no way that they would say that. There's no way that they would say it like this. So I should be able to tell it. And like, that's a good way to like, you can ramp up the challenge. It's like, okay, first start with two characters I know are like complete opposites. So like Gandalf and Sauron, like a pretty clear difference. Or, then you get a little bit closer and you're like, okay, Gandalf and Saruman, like they have a lot of common ground, but there's like a difference of opinion. And then you're like, okay, well, let's just like let all the dwarves in here and have a conversation between 6 or 7 different people at the same time, and can I still make their voices distinct enough to tell the difference without saying, Gimli said this and Legolas said that. Like, it's just like, just let them say it, and if I can't tell the difference, then I need to work on that a little bit.
Well, that's a good exercise.
It's difficult though. Because like obviously, sometimes we all say the same thing, but like, so it's not the idea that you always have to be able to tell. If I have a random quote from a book, I don't have to know, oh yes, this person obviously said it. But the idea is that like at any given time, I should know who's saying what. In the same way that grammar is there to remove ambiguity, character voice also hands you a little cheat sheet of like, this character is the one that's talking. So you don't have to label everything with like, oh, Steve said, Frank said, because it gets really old really quickly.
Right. Yeah, my assassin thing is always snarky. She's like bitter, snarky. And so that's always peppered in her responses, and like when she's always sarcastic. She's British, so she has this British, not humor, but that dryness, that snarkiness going on. So, and I could, it's something that you want to add because it's not just for your readers, but it's for you. I mean, you're writing this story, and you want to have a great time with it. Otherwise, it's going to be so completely bland and boring and flat. And that'd be terrible to have to write like what 80,000, 90,000 words of this, so you're doing it for your benefit, you want different flavors in there. Like I said in the beginning, we want different colors.
I think another good exercise as well. And this works especially well if you don't get overly excited and just start writing right away. If you do a little bit of planning for your characters before you start writing your novel, which is not really something I ever do. But anywho,
You did.
character interviews. So like you sit
Right.
down, and you could do this at any point when you're writing your book, right? Just whether it's to just check that your character is doing what they should be doing or things like that. So sit down and interview your character. Ask them where they're from, ask them what their responsibilities are, what kinds of things bring them joy, what makes them uncomfortable. Those are the kind of questions, like, you want to ask those like really, really deep questions, the ones that as people, when people ask us, we kind of squirm a little. We don't want to answer them. They make us uncomfortable. Ask those really deep questions about your character and then write down how they would respond to those. And that's how you're really going to start fleshing out that voice and character.
Yeah,
how
and we
about-
talked about it. Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, so like whenever we were talking about our, favorite tropes or like the top 10 tropes, one of the things we brought up was the fireside chat. And so that's another exercise that I really love doing, is I love taking people that have similar roles in different stories or that may never meet and just putting them together to have dialogue so that I can really develop what is the difference between these characters. Am I just having, villains from these 3 stories and they're all kind of, just shoehorned in here because I need some antagonist? But like, what makes them unique? What makes their perspective on the world unique? And so just really getting to develop that, and that using a trope that may never actually end up in a story because they're in 3 different universes, but just getting that exercise in is good.
I was thinking of Holly's mentioning interviewing your characters. Like, I feel maybe some that are a little more flighty or nervous are going to respond quicker, just to get something out there, or they want to be liked, or they want to be trusted, or so that's how they're thinking. That's how the mind is thinking. So kind of go through that too. What's how they not just what they're going to say, but like how they're going to do it. Because sometimes people respond very quickly, and other people will just kind of think and consider, and maybe look around up in the air a little bit before they answer. So you're just building different people, and it's fun. It really is. I hope this doesn't sound like it's hard. I mean, it kind of is, okay, but guess what? All of writing is hard. There's really nothing. I don't know what is easy about writing, but it's fun. This is like a fun, hard thing.
Yeah, you make a really good point about that too, Bob, because your pacing for each character is going to be slightly different. So if you have a character like that who's answering in very short sentences, that is going to read totally different than if you have a character that would be me if I was in a book that just rambles on and on and on for 45 minutes. Those are going to be 2 completely different sections, and you're going to be able to see that, or you should be able to see that in your dialogue. So it's not just about like how they talk, but like you said, like the way that they talk, and incorporate that. If you know that they're uncomfortable or whatever, make their sentences the appropriate length to reflect who they are as a character.
Yeah, like they're thinking about, what they're going to say or how they should say it. And then you can jump in there later. I think we were talking about if each chapter is going to be a different character, or something like that. But then that's when you can go into those thoughtful people that are thinking a lot. They're probably going to have a lot of deep POV where, they're just kind of introspective and just kind of thinking on, and hardly any dialogue, with others, versus somebody who's just like all the time, talking
or even if they're alone, like you're gonna have some characters that are just talking to themselves because they're like, this is just how I process. Whereas other characters are like, oh no, I've got this internal dialogue and take on more of a narrator role.
So speaking of narrator, do you feel like the narration of your story should fall in the same point of view as your character, or should follow your character's voice, or do you think that the narrator should have one consistent voice throughout your entire novel and then just have the characters' voices when they're doing their own dialogue.
It's a good
I
question.
will say, for my 2 cents, I love it whenever the narration is colored by the character that it is their POV, because then I can get, some chapters where I have an unreliable narrator and some where I have a reliable narrator, and it gets into this question of like what's real, what's not, and it like adds that element of mystery, but then also like I get more time in that character to understand how they see the world. And so a bit of narration might later color how I see something they say. Whereas like if I have, an omniscient narrator, no matter whose POV it is, then it's like, okay, well, like how much of this should I take like for granted as part of like, does the character realize these things, or is this something that they're unaware of? Like dramatic irony gets really complicated whenever you get into that stuff too. It's like really at the end of the day, I think it comes down to be consistent.
Yeah.
As with almost everything in writing, being consistent is the golden rule.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. I was thinking about how I write. So I do write. Most of the time, it's a different chapter, and it's going to be a different character. So I'm that person through the whole chapter. So that means my narration is going to be just the way she sees things and she does things, the way she's twiddling a pencil, or the way she's, like my assassin is cleaning her knife or something like that, or fixing her, rearranging her poisons, or what I mean. Like there's just I'm there with her, right? I mean, that's what I want to do, is I want to immerse myself, the reader, into her shoes, and just kind of like you have a GoPro just on her shoulder, right? And you're just walking around, you're listening to her, and watching her do stuff. That's kind of how I write.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely the same way. I think a lot of it too is because as I'm writing from that character's, like, the scene is revolving around this one character's point of view. And so I like the narration to kind of go along with that. So within my narration, it is the narrator's perspective on the situation, but it's influenced by the character's voice. So it kind of feels like it's coming from the character, right? Like the narrator is the character, even though they're not. But I just feel like it just adds a little bit more weight, and it helps me develop those characters a little bit more. And it allows me to explore the world again, from that character's point of view without it actually being their point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like makes this kind of like my favorite thing, because it's like you might describe things that they don't see, but I feel like it should be within close enough proximity that they could have if they were looking in the right spot. And so like that's where I try and keep the dramatic irony of like, oh man, right behind them like was this, and it's like they didn't know, and like maybe they get attacked by it, maybe they don't, like maybe it never comes back up until like 20 chapters later, but it was like they were right there, and if they had just turned around they would have seen it. So, but like I don't want to talk about something that's happening across town. Like little did they know across town such and such happened. That's not how I write. Like I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of stories out there where it's like, yeah, okay.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing we haven't talked about is just what about body language and just their expressions, facial expressions, body language, shoulders slumped or chin up and shoulders back. They walk with an air of, something, like something, I don't know. I can't talk right now. I can barely write and I can barely talk right now. So, but there's that aspect of the POT. It's not just what they're saying and how they're saying it, but it's also when they're quiet, what are they doing, right?
Absolutely. I have an exercise for this, and I know a few other authors who do this as well. Have a mirror around you when you're writing, especially when you're going through and editing, because a lot of the times I think we'll get sucked into just like, oh, an eye roll or a shoulder shrug. And you'll see that over and over. And it's because you just don't fully pay attention to your expressions. And there's so many opportunities where if you have a mirror in front of you and you're like reading your character's dialogue, watch your own face and see what it does. Because a lot of the time when you're reading those words, you're going to start making all these crazy faces and you're going to be like, wow, that would look really good in my book, because that's what the character's face should actually look like. So I love that. I have a huge mirror. It's actually right here beside my desk. And I'll do
Mhm.
that a lot of the times when I'm writing. I'll look over and be like, like frumpy
Yeah.
face, and like,
Huh.
and it really helps.
I don't know why I never thought about that. That's
I will
crazy.
say I'm kind of an agent of chaos, and so I love doing that. But I'm like, if I sneeze while I'm writing, I'm like, character sneezed, and it's like may have been very unfortunate for them, but guess what? Such is life. I'm sorry you were giving your big impassioned speech to the king to try and motivate him to do what you needed, but you just sneezed and messed it up.
And then you got snot all over your robes, and
Mhm.
that's funny. No, I've never heard about that, Holly. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's great.
Having a mirror and just kind of watching yourself. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
It's
So
good too. Like sometimes if I'm looking for a specific word, or like I know that their face should look like this, or I have something in my mind, but you can see something in your
right,
mind, but you just can't quite describe it.
right,
It's
Mhm.
really great for, when I think that, maybe they look like this, but
right.
then once I actually see myself make the face, I'm like, no, 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 that word does not describe it properly. This word's way better. And it's
Hmm,
like seeing it just triggers that for me.
hmm. Perfect. How about culture, geographic background? That would probably have something to do with, right? And most of this, we're writing fantasy, so I mean, they're made up. But I feel like we're gonna have like I don't know, like a southern desert, where maybe people are darker. Well, we'll have like a far north in the icy where people are, they're blonde. You know what I mean? So it's almost like we're kind
Mhm.
of copying or mimicking our own, Earth here.
Yeah, I think things in that realm are important to like analyze. Like, okay, what part of this is like, okay, actually evolutionary things where it's like, okay, I'm in an environment, I adapted to the environment. Whereas like other things are like, okay, a certain accent. Like, is that really based off of whether you live in the mountains or near the ocean, or like, so taking that with a grain of salt. But like I am writing a book or a series where it's like mashed up Meiji era Japan with Industrial Revolution Chicago. And it's like, because those are like, there's some similarities there, and there's some interesting like, okay, like how does this interplay with one another and contradict one another? But then like getting into it, it's like, okay, like how does all of this work? And yeah, I think taking influence and then really analyzing like what part of this is, you know, good to
Mhm.
hold on to, what part is good to like throw away, and how can I be
Mhm.
respectful of all those things. Like, I mean, obviously the respectful part is always the touchy thing of, you want to do it well. And I think it was probably Sanderson that was talking about one way to really nail it down and avoid being just stereotypical is like, if you're going to have like an actual cultural touch point, don't just go Europe or Asia,
Uh-huh.
Africa. Go,
Uh-huh.
I want to be talking about like the Stormlight archives. They're based off of the Mongol Empire, not just as a whole, but like after they've conquered all these things and these like warlords, what do they do with an empire? Like
Hmm.
they fought. They don't know how to run an empire. And it's like that specific time period within a specific region. It's like
Mhm.
that is the cultural influence I'm taking, and I'm going to be true and respectful to it. And so, like, what parts of that make sense in a fantasy world and what parts don't?
Hmm. Wow, that sounds fun. I mean, mine is very, very simple right now. Yeah, she's from England, and then and then my other character is from goodness gracious, San Francisco area, West Coast, West Coast,
Mhm.
California. So I'm not messing around with any fantasy stuff. Holly, your story has like silver haired people, right, or white haired silver haired people,
Yeah, so I describe it as frost colored. And
frost colored.
I don't know how that came to me. I didn't want it to be like white haired or like gray
Yeah,
haired because she's not old.
right.
So I
Yeah,
was just kind of like thinking about it, and that was what I came up with, was her frost colored hair.
that's 100%
Um
fair. That's why Zoe Frost in Arcanist Cookbook, their name is Frost because they're from the north and they've got white hair. So
Oh, they
oh,
have white
see?
hair too. Okay, okay, that makes sense. That made it easy.
nailed it.
But but Holly, is everyone where she's from your main character? Are they all frost haired, or is it just her? Or
No, so she did actually inherit that from her dad. And that's
Hmm.
kind of one of the few things that she remembers of him, because she lost her dad when she was just little. And so she kind of just, her mom has made up all these stories and told her these stories. And the thing is, like, you know, her mom told her so many stories that she doesn't know anymore what's real and what is just made up by her mom, except for when she has dreams and she dreams about him and she sees her dad, you know, with the same color hair as her and she recognizes him. But he's missing, so we don't know much about his heritage or where he comes from.
Okay.
And of course, the world at this time has been basically at war for centuries, and so everyone's kind of spread out. So that's something that I plan on exploring in the next book, is just a little bit more of those heritages. But there are those links there.
Nice.
Yeah. And I think too, like we're talking about, you know, real life cultural things, but also like looking at kind of the more stereotypical fantasy, because we're all writing, you know, fantasy in one way or another, like, you know, with orcs and things like that. So like, I think I mentioned it before we started recording, actually, that like my orcs speak with, you know, a proper British accent, and they have their own form of magic that is actually contract magic. So it's like they have a legal system that is literally magic, because it's like, what is, you know, less orcish in our mindset than that? And also, I thought it was funny because what was it, Terry Pratchett, that had like the swords glow blue in front, like with lawyers instead of orcs. Like, well, what if orcs and lawyers were just like synonymous, and that's why the swords glow blue? And so it's like, that's a fun way to like do it. And it's like, take these two contradicting things and just make them one. And so just having weird influences like that is just a joy.
I think that music is a really good one as well.
Mm.
I know a lot of people say, like, what's your book playlist or what's your
Yeah.
writing playlist? I have a character playlist. And it's really fun for me. My main character is very like, she's very cool. She's pretty badass. And the playlist that I have for her is also the playlist that I use when I go to the gym. And
Nice.
I take on the mindset of my main character
It sounds
when
like
I am
it.
at the gym. I am walking around that place like I'm a freaking assassin. Like if
Wow.
someone was to come up to me in the parking lot, I would get them. Like
Jeez.
there is no, you know what I mean? Like,
Damn, you dropped your keys. Like it's stabbed in
I'll
the
drop
face.
you.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm like, it's all because of that music, right? I now associate that playlist and like these songs with the mindset of that character,
Fun
that
is
specific
that?
character. So now when I listen to it, I'm like immediately like, all right, here we go. It's on. Like sword battles, like we got this. Like daggers, I could hit a target from 50 miles away. Like it's, you know.
Wow. That's amazing.
That's something I really enjoy. So something I do is that, like, originally, like when I first started writing, I was like, okay, this character's going to have a theme song. That one song, I'm going to put it on repeat while I write their chapters. But then I was like, well, you know, people are a little bit more complicated than one song. So what I started doing was pick a band, and that entire discography would be that, because it's like you've got a very similar style, very thematic kind of a go like tie through. And so I was like, okay, cool. Like you might have an album that's different, a song that's different, where it's like, oh, suddenly, you know, a hardcore metal band's doing a love ballad. I was like, okay, cool. Like I can have that song on for that specific scene. And I think that gives me this like continuity of voice while also getting some range within it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I actually never thought of it, but I mean, I guess I have done that only because it's fun. I mean, I'm writing because it's fun. And so, yeah, Two Steps from Hell has a lot of amazing tracks just for the series I'm writing, Coil and Fang. So, also, Penny Dreadful has an amazing soundtrack too that I absolutely love. And so, yeah, kind of the same thing. I think this will fall under exercises for people that are trying to find their character voice. Yeah, find what are these people listening to? How about why are they listening to this?
Yeah, I think the thing that made me think about it was reading the manga for Bleach, and like each character like had an introductory page, and it was like, hey, like this is like their favorite music, this is their favorite color, and it was just like, oh yeah, I guess I never really thought about that for my characters. But then the first time writing like an inspirational speech to 3 Days Grace's "Let's Start a Riot," I was like, ooh, this is like intense. I really enjoy doing this. Also, like, what are some characters that you feel like have really strong voices that you can instantly be like, oh yeah, that's something that like I can immediately call attention to, or like for whatever reason, the thing that I instantly thought of was the Joker from the Batman movies, like Heath Ledger's Joker in particular. And it's just like there's this like the way that he speaks, the way that's like these almost like false starts and the licking the lips. Like there's all this characterization that comes through just in the way he's talking. Like, how can we get that to come through in our writing as well?
I think another good thing that you can do as well is you can use the area around your character to like invoke their memories and things like that through your narration that are going to reflect on the character. So I have one character that I wanted to make her kind of like, really fun, but kind of clumsy and just like very like nonchalant about things, whereas everyone else is really serious. And she's kind of like, oh, whatever, like a little bit of a party girl. And so I have this one scene where she comments on the fur rug that her brother was like rubbing his feet on, and she's like, the narration is saying like the fur rug that she had to replace because she spilled a whole bottle of wine on during one particularly festive Eidolon celebration. And so it's like little things like that you can bring up through your narration that are going to reflect on the character, and that's going to bring out the character's voice, because now you're like, okay, who's this character that's just spilling wine on rugs, right? And that just influences your view of that character, and it influences your character voice.
Yeah, and two, like even just like, okay, you have a character that spills wine on a rug, but like the way that they think of it, like, is it like, man, like I can't believe he's doing that, like think about, I already had to replace it once, like you know how expensive it is, or like, oh, the fond memories of like I had to replace this rug because like I spilled wine on it, and man, that was such a good time. Like the things that they focus on and they think about, and the way that like, their environment around them is like just like touchstones for their history.
Yeah, I didn't base that part off myself, I swear.
Remember that funny time I spilled wine all over the place? Because
everywhere.
It was just a
in the gym.
bear, like,
I was in the gym with a bottle of wine.
Siberian tiger,
Holly comes back next week with like white hair, like, oh, here we go. Frost colored.
I am now my character.
Yeah. Oh, God.
I mean, self-insert.
She's armed. That's awesome. Yeah. I have seen a couple of times where an author was doing something, a signing, book signing or whatever, and somebody would dress up cosplay as a character. I think that would be, this is not even anywhere close to what we're talking about today, but that would be amazing. That would be something that I would love to see at some point. Somebody dress up as my characters. So.
Yeah.
Anyways,
we'll do an episode where we dress up as our characters.
But I feel like if we do a good job, I'm going to be wearing a wig, I guess. But I feel as though if we're following all these things, we're making great characters. People are going to love them, fall in love with them, and then, in the end, they'll want to, thank us for them. All right, I'm done rambling.
Or they will hate them, which is also the other thing.
Yes.
And that can be really tough as well. Sometimes writing those character voices that people, like everyone has a character that everyone needs to hate, right?
Yep.
And it can be really tough because nobody wants to hate anybody on purpose, right? So that I think is something that some people can struggle with. And I like to just think about all the things that just really, really annoy me about all kinds of people and just compile them into one character.
Oh no.
That's a lot.
Yeah, but like that can be really tough, I think, for people writing a character that you're not supposed to like.
Right.
And you obviously that's the character whose mindset you don't really want to get into.
Yeah.
Because then as soon as you get into that character mindset of a character that nobody likes, you're like, well, he's actually really sensitive, but it's just the way that things come across. And then that's going to change your character from this character that we all want to hate to this character we feel sorry for, which is not what we want.
Yeah.
That's
fine.
So
but I mean, this is the secret to morally great characters written well is,
yes, it is,
a good character voice and getting into like, this is why they are the way they are and making them sympathetic.
But we got to do one of those, huh? Morally great characters.
We'll have to dive into that.
Excellent.
My favorite.
All right. We'll do that the next hour. Here goes a special 3-hour episode. Well, it's time for our don'ts list. Don't do this. in POV character voice. Don't do this. I'll go first because I don't want anybody taking mine. I always go last. Somebody always takes mine, and then I'm stuck. I'm gonna say, don't forget about your villain. Antagonists are different from villains, but your villain is also a character, and you have to make him all this stuff we just talked about. Interview your villain. Why does he do the things that he does? Where is he from? How does he talk? How does he not talk? What are his facial expressions? How long does he take to answer a question? Because the more we build up our villain, instead of just being, I was going to say Darth Vader, but actually he was a very complex character in the end. Once we got to know the poor fellow, slaughtering all those innocent kids. Yeah. Kid slaughterer. But anyway, he's a good guy now. But, don't forget the villain. Yeah. I love we're going to have to do an episode on villains soon, because I absolutely love villain creation.
Yeah, because what if your villain's doing it so that he can end world hunger?
Yeah. Snap.
Anti-villain.
Thanos.
Well, okay. Well, Thanos is poorly thought out because he should have snapped and doubled all the universe's resources, and we all know it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go and say, don't hold back. There is a certain amount of vulnerability involved with really developing a character voice, because unless it's a self-insert, which then it comes with a whole other level of vulnerability because it's your voice and being open and vulnerable about what's going on. But it's a practice of empathy to develop a voice for a character, because you're putting yourself in somebody else's shoes who's lived a different life than you, and you're having to understand something from somebody who's lived that life, whether it's good or bad and ugly. And so just don't hold back. And the vulnerability of it all is what makes us love characters, even the characters we love to hate. That is what makes us love them, is that they're real in that gritty sort of polished way.
I like that.
I will say, now following up on that wonderfully deep and well thought out answer. Thanks, guys.
My pleasure.
I will say, just going back to what I said when we first kind of started talking about it, is don't stress out if you don't get your character's voice on that first draft, or even if you don't really have it on your second draft. It's okay. As you're writing, again, a lot of the time you're just trying to get through. As you're writing, think about the character's voice. But if you hit a point where you're really fretting, would they say this? Would they not say it? It's okay to write it, because that you can always use that as maybe that's a turning point in the character, right? And maybe their voice is going to start changing at that point going forward. Or maybe they've just gone through a traumatic event and it's a part of them that they've been suppressing that's suddenly coming out, or whatever it is. It's okay. You can put those things down, because you're not going to really know that character until you've gone through this book a couple times. So don't worry about it if you're not getting a consistent voice right away. As long as it's consistent in the end, that's what matters. So it's okay to work through those little tough spots, and have a couple different voices for your character until you really flesh it all out and understand who they are.
Yeah, that's excellent.
And on that too, I will say that's part of why we have test readers, alpha readers, beta readers, is hey, I know I've brought that up a couple of times, and hey, does this really sound is there issues with the way that this person is expressing this emotion, or the way that they're talking throughout this chapter? So that's great, because they have this way of their thinking of this character's voice, and they'll let you know that something felt off, and maybe it was supposed to, maybe it wasn't, but those are all good data points.
Yep. All right. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. That was our first episode on character voice. Is that right?
No,
POV. I knew that.
You knew that. We all knew that. It was a test for the.
It was a test for you, Austin. You passed. Holly, you came in a close second, but anyway.
Yay!
Yay! Okay, so we're done. All right. So so I asked before, how do you write your character's POV, and what are some other ways that that we didn't think of, because we don't know everything. We do, but we pretend we don't. But what are some other ways that you guys can come up with different exercises or things you've read? So just share them with us. Share in a Discord if you like. But as always, don't forget to rate and subscribe to our channels at the links below so you don't miss any of the Writer's Realm content. We always love to hear from our listeners. So if you have a question or topic you want us to dive into, please get in touch. And until then, we will see you. Have a good night, a good day. Good week.
Adios.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. See ya.